No raise this year. That's how she said it. Not a long explanation, not a careful preamble, just 5 words placed in the middle of the room like she was reading a weather update. It was 3:47 p.m. I remember because the wall clock was directly behind her, one of those round office clocks with thin black hands and a faint tick you only notice when nobody is talking. And nobody was talking. The meeting room was on the 3rd floor, the small one we used for one-on-ones. 2 chairs, 1 table, glass on 3 sides so you could see anyone walking past in the hallway. My manager sat across from me. HR sat to his right, a slim folder in front of her, closed. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Whatever was inside had already been decided in another room with other people. Budget alignment for the year hasn't allowed for adjustments at your level, she said, and that was the closest thing to a reason I got. My manager nodded. He didn't look at me. He looked at the folder. He looked at his hands. He looked at the corner of the table like he was hoping a phone would buzz and pull him out of the room. I didn't say anything. Not because I didn't have anything to say. Because in that exact second, 14 years of work, 14 years of early mornings, late nights, weekends that didn't count, holidays I worked through quietly, collapsed into a single sentence. And a sentence like that doesn't ask for a response. It just settles. My name is Daniel Costa. I'm 46 years old. At the time of that meeting, I was a senior account manager at one of the largest logistics firms in the region. 14 years in. I had joined when the office had 30 people in it. By that afternoon, it had over 400. I had stayed through 3 CEOs, 2 restructurings, a merger that almost didn't happen, and one near collapse in 2017 that nobody in upper management ever wanted to talk about again. I had handled the client account that brought in 22% of our regional revenue, alone, with one assistant who kept getting reassigned, and the answer was no raise this year. HR continued, careful with her wording. We appreciate your continued contribution and we're confident this is a temporary situation. Temporary. That word stayed with me longer than the rest. Temporary like a season, like a rain that would pass. Except it had already been temporary the year before, and the year before that, when the raises had been smaller than inflation, smaller than the rising cost of the school my daughter attended, smaller than anything that could honestly be called a raise at all. 3 rounds of temporary had quietly turned into a salary that hadn't kept pace with anything since 2019. I looked at my manager. He finally met my eyes. He didn't say anything either. He just gave me that closed-mouth smile people use at funerals, the one that's meant to convey sympathy without committing to anything. And in that smile, I understood something I had been refusing to understand for a long time. He had known. He had walked into that room already knowing. Maybe for a day, maybe a week, maybe since the last quarterly review when I had submitted the numbers that earned the team its biggest contract of the year. He had sat across from me, listened to my plans, taken notes, and known the whole time. Any questions? HR asked, hands folded over the unopened folder. I shook my head once, slow. No, I said, I think I understood, and I had. Maybe for the first time in 14 years I had understood exactly where I stood, not where I thought I stood, where I actually stood. I left the meeting room at 3:54 p.m. 7 minutes. That's how long it took to undo 14 years. I walked back to my desk the same way I had walked there 1,000 mornings, past the printer that always jammed, past the kitchen with the coffee machine someone had taped a passive-aggressive note to, past the row of glass offices that belonged to people who had joined the company long after me and somehow ended up with doors that closed. My desk was in the open area, 4th row from the window. Same desk I had been sitting at for 9 years, since the last office reshuffle. I sat down. I didn't open my laptop. I just looked at the screen, dark and silent, with the company logo bouncing slowly across it in the corner. Nobody came over. Nobody asked how the meeting had gone. That part told me something too. They already knew. Maybe not the specifics, but the general shape of it. Word travels fast in offices, faster than email, faster than the official channels. By the time I sat back down, half the floor had already decided what kind of meeting it had been. I opened my laptop eventually. There were 43 new emails. 3 were marked urgent. One was from a client asking about a shipment that had been delayed at the port in Santos, a problem I had personally negotiated through customs twice that month. I read the message. I read it again. And for the first time in 14 years, I didn't feel that small jolt of pressure that used to push me into immediate action. I just felt tired, tired in a way that wasn't physical. Tired in the way you get when something you believed in stops being true and you realize you've been carrying it for longer than you noticed. I closed the laptop again. I looked at the wall. There was a framed certificate hanging 2 desks down. Employee of the Quarter 2021. My name on it. The frame was crooked. It had been crooked for 2 years. I had stopped trying to straighten it. At 5:30 p.m. I left. Not late, not early. Same time I always did when I had nothing scheduled after work. I took the same elevator, said goodbye to the same security guard at the lobby, walked to the same parking garage. The day looked exactly like every other day I had spent at that company, except something underneath had shifted, and I was the only person in the building who knew it. In the car, I sat for a while before starting the engine. The garage was quiet. A few cars away, someone was loading boxes into a trunk. I watched them without really watching. My phone was on the passenger seat. I picked it up, scrolled past nothing. Then I opened LinkedIn. I hadn't updated my profile in over 4 years. The last entry still said Senior Account Manager with the date I had been promoted, which now felt embarrassingly far back. I didn't update anything. Not yet. I just looked at the connections list. Old colleagues. People who had left over the years for competitors, for startups, for retirement. People I had trained who were now running departments at other firms. People who had once said, "If you ever want to talk, you know where to find me." I had always brushed those comments off politely. Loyalty mattered, stability mattered. I had a mortgage, a daughter starting college, a wife who had taken a part-time role to be home more. You don't shake the table when there are plates on it, but the plates had just been moved without me. That much was clear. I scrolled slowly. Eventually, I stopped on a name. Ricardo Menezes. He had left our company 6 years ago for a competitor. We had stayed in occasional touch. Birthdays, the odd holiday message. I read his profile twice. Then I closed the app, started the car, and drove home thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. That night, I didn't tell my wife. Not right away. We had dinner the way we always did, my daughter at the table with us, talking about a professor who had assigned too much reading, my wife asking whether we needed to buy more rice on the weekend. Ordinary things, small things, the kind of conversation that holds a house together more than people give it credit for. I listened more than I talked. Helena noticed. She always did, but she didn't push. She had been married to me for 19 years. She knew the difference between a quiet night and a night where something was sitting on me. After dinner, my daughter went to her room. Helena and I cleaned the kitchen together, the way we had cleaned it every weeknight for years. She washed, I dried. The dishwasher had broken the previous summer and we had never replaced it. It was on a list somewhere of things we were going to do eventually. When the counter was clean and the lights in the living room were low, she finally turned to me. "What happened today?" I told her. Not all of it. Not the long, swirling version that had been running in my head all afternoon. Just the facts, the meeting, the 5 words, the unopened folder, the way my manager had nodded and said nothing. She listened the whole way through without interrupting. When I finished, she didn't react the way I had expected. She didn't get angry. She didn't tell me to march in there tomorrow and demand a meeting with the regional director. She just nodded slowly and said, "Okay." Then she said something I wasn't ready for. "Daniel, I've been waiting for you to see this for a long time." I looked at her. She wasn't accusing me. There was no edge in her voice. Just something gentle and direct at the same time, the kind of honesty that takes years of marriage to deliver without it sounding like criticism. She told me she had noticed over the past 2 or 3 years the slow change in how I came home, quieter, more withdrawn, less excited when good things happened at work, more automatic when she asked about my day. She had thought about saying something earlier. She hadn't because she knew I would hear it as pressure, and pressure wasn't what I needed. What I needed, she said, was to see it for myself. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. She went to bed around 11. I told her I'd be up in a few minutes. I wasn't. I stayed there until almost 1 in the morning, the lamp in the corner the only light on in the house. I thought about the company, not the abstract version of it, the real version. The people, the projects, the contracts, the small everyday mechanics of what I did. I thought about who would call me if I disappeared tomorrow. I thought about who actually understood how the largest client account worked, the one I had been quietly stitching together for almost a decade. I thought about my manager nodding in that meeting, and I thought about the way my last 3 performance reviews had said exceeds expectations in every single category, and I thought about HR's careful word, temporary. Then I did something I hadn't done in 14 years. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and updated my LinkedIn profile. Title, description, skills, accomplishments. I didn't make it dramatic, I just made it accurate. For the first time in years, I described what I actually did, not the way the company had framed it, but the way it actually worked when I sat down to do it every morning. The differences were larger than I expected. Reading my own profile back, I realized how much of myself I had been quietly hiding. I went to bed at 1:30. I slept better than I had in months. Ricardo called me on Thursday. I hadn't reached out. I had only updated my profile, nothing more, no message, no signal. But that's how networks work in industries small enough to recognize their own people. He saw the update at some point on Wednesday evening. By Thursday at 10:14 a.m., my phone was buzzing on the desk while I was halfway through reading a customs document I had read 3 times already without retaining anything. "Daniel," he said when I picked up. "Long time." His voice was the same, a little more relaxed than I remembered. People who leave the wrong companies usually sound that way a few years out, like something in their shoulders has finally come down. We did the small talk first. His kids, my daughter, the city, the traffic, the weather. Then he said, "I noticed your profile changed." I said yes. I didn't elaborate, he didn't push. We had known each other long enough to understand the rhythm of a conversation that isn't really about what it sounds like it's about. "Are you open to a conversation?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "We met on Friday after work." He picked the place. A small restaurant about 15 minutes from my office, far enough that I wouldn't run into anyone, close enough that I didn't have to invent a reason for being late home. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in a booth in the back, a glass of water and a folder in front of him. The folder caught my eye. Folders had started meaning something different to me that week. He didn't open it right away. We ate. We talked about the years since he had left. He told me about his current company, a competitor of ours, slightly smaller in revenue but growing faster, with a different operational model and a leadership team that, according to him, actually listened. I had heard pieces of this before, from other people who had crossed over. I had always treated it as the standard story former employees tell to make themselves feel better about the move. Sitting across from him that night, watching him eat without checking his phone every 2 minutes, I started to wonder if I had been wrong about that. When the plates were cleared, he finally opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper. He turned it toward me. "This is what we'd offer," he said. "Not a final number, a starting point." I looked at it. I looked at it again. The number was almost exactly double my current base salary. Below it, a line for variable compensation tied to client portfolio performance. Below that, equity. Below that, a relocation allowance I didn't even need since the office was in the same city. I didn't react immediately. I had learned over years of negotiating contracts on behalf of other people, never to react to a number in front of the person who wrote it. I asked questions instead. Who would I report to? What was the team structure? What was the client portfolio size? What was the expectation for the first 6 months? What was the expectation for the first year? What was the policy on the kind of work I had been doing, the part that involved direct relationships with customs officials and port authorities, the part that didn't fit neatly into any job description, but was the reason the contracts actually moved? Ricardo answered every question without consulting the folder. He had thought about this. So had his leadership team, apparently. They had been watching the market for 2 years. They had a specific gap in their portfolio. They believed I was the person to fill it. He said this without flattery, the way you describe a part you need for a machine. It was the most clear-eyed assessment of my value I had heard in a decade. I told him I would think about it. He said he expected nothing less. I didn't sleep much that weekend, not in a tortured way. In a way where my mind kept circling the same set of facts from different angles, looking for something I might have missed. I had been at my company for 14 years. The number on that sheet of paper was almost double my current salary. Those two facts didn't fit together cleanly. They suggested one of two things. Either I had been dramatically underpaid for years, or the offer in front of me was inflated for reasons I didn't yet understand. I needed to figure out which one was true before I made a move. On Saturday morning, I called two people. The first was an old colleague, Teresa, who had left our industry entirely about 5 years ago and now worked in executive recruiting. She was the kind of person who would tell me the truth even if it wasn't flattering. The second was a former client, Henrique, who had moved between 3 different logistics companies in 12 years and had a clearer view of the market than almost anyone I knew. I didn't tell either of them about the specific offer. I just asked them, hypothetically, what someone with my profile, my years, my client portfolio, would be worth on the open market today. Their answers were within 5% of each other. Both of them landed almost exactly where Ricardo's offer was. Teresa was the one who said it out loud. Daniel, if you're making less than that, you're being underpaid, by a lot. And the longer you stay, the harder it becomes to correct, because the next employer benchmarks you against your current salary, not your actual value. That sentence stayed with me through Sunday. I thought about it in the car on the way to the supermarket. I thought about it during lunch with my parents, who had no idea any of this was happening. I thought about it that evening when I sat on the small balcony off our bedroom with a coffee, watching the lights come on in the building across the street. The longer you stay, the harder it becomes to correct. 14 years was a long time to stay. 14 years of small raises, of temporary situations, of being praised in performance reviews and forgotten in compensation discussions. The gap between what I was worth and what I was paid hadn't appeared overnight. It had been growing quietly for years, one missed adjustment at a time, and I had been the one who let it grow because I had told myself that loyalty would eventually be rewarded. It hadn't been. It wasn't going to be. The meeting on Tuesday had told me that with 5 words. On Sunday night, I made the decision. I didn't tell Helena right away. I wanted to sleep on it one more time, not to second-guess it, but to make sure I was waking up to the same conclusion I had gone to sleep with. I did. Monday morning, before I left for work, I told her. She listened, nodded, and said, "Good, just that, good." No celebration, no relief, no questions. She had already done her thinking earlier than I had. I drove to the office that Monday with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not excitement, just clarity. I knew what I was going to do. I knew the order I was going to do it in. I had spent 14 years managing the operational details of other people's transitions, contracts ending, suppliers changing, accounts moving from one provider to another. I knew exactly how to manage a clean exit. The difference was, this time the contract that was ending was mine. I sent Ricardo a message at 9:02 a.m. from my personal email. 3 lines. I had thought about his offer. I was prepared to move forward. I asked when we could finalize the terms. He replied within 11 minutes. The terms came through on Tuesday morning. Formal offer letter, signed by his managing director, dated and structured the way offers should be structured when a company is serious. There were 2 small adjustments from the number Ricardo had shown me in the restaurant, both upward. The variable compensation tier had been clarified, with specific thresholds tied to portfolio retention and growth, numbers I could actually meet without bending the rules. The equity portion had a vesting schedule that was generous compared to industry standard. The start date they proposed was 4 weeks out, which gave me enough room to manage a proper handover at my current company without dragging it into something messy. I read the letter 3 times. Then I read it again with Helena that evening, the 2 of us at the kitchen table after dinner, the way we had read every important document of our adult lives. She didn't comment as I went through it. She just nodded at the parts that mattered and frowned slightly at the parts that needed a second read. When we got to the end, she said, "This is real." It was. I had spent the past few days half expecting some catch to surface, some line in fine print that would explain why the offer was so much higher than what I had been making. There wasn't one. The catch wasn't in the offer. The catch had been in the 14 years I had spent accepting less than I was worth, while telling myself it would balance out eventually. I signed the letter on Wednesday morning. I scanned it, sent it back, kept the original in the drawer of my home office desk. Then I went to work. I didn't resign that day. I had a plan, and the plan required patience. The next morning, Thursday, I had a regularly scheduled call with the largest client account I managed, the one that brought in 22% of our regional revenue, 3 of their senior people on the line. We went through the open shipments, the customs issues, the projected volumes for the next quarter. Standard call. At the end, when the agenda was finished, the head of their operations asked me casually whether I would be at their year-end planning meeting in November. I said I would confirm closer to the date. He laughed and said, "Daniel, you've been at every one for 10 years. I'm not worried." That comment sat with me for the rest of the day, not because it made me feel guilty about leaving, because it made me realize how much of that relationship existed between me and them, not between my company and them. The client had a contract with the company, but the trust, the rhythm, the 10 years of handled problems and quietly resolved disputes that lived in the relationship between specific people. Mine and theirs. When I moved, the contract would stay where it was, at least on paper, but the trust would do what trust always does. It would follow the person who had earned it. I didn't say any of this to anyone at my company. I didn't make any move toward that client, didn't drop any hints, didn't position anything. I had no intention of doing anything unethical. The contract belonged to my employer. I would honor that on the way out and after. What I would not do was pretend that the dynamics of that account were anything other than what they were. Thursday afternoon, I started preparing the handover documentation. Quietly, on my own time in the evenings, I built a clean, organized package. Every active client, every open issue, every contact at customs and at the port, every workaround we used for the recurring problems that nobody upstairs wanted to acknowledge existed. I made it thorough. I made it honest. I made it the kind of document I would have wanted to receive if I had been the one staying. That was the version of professionalism I had decided to leave with. I resigned on Monday morning at 9:30 a.m. I had chosen the day and the time deliberately. Monday because it gave the company a full week to begin absorbing the news before the next round of client meetings. 9:30 because it was early enough that my manager hadn't yet been pulled into anything that would make him reschedule, and late enough that HR was at their desks. I sent the request for a meeting at 9:02. Subject line, brief conversation this morning, no agenda. He replied within 4 minutes asking if 9:30 worked. It did. We met in the same small meeting room on the 3rd floor, same chairs, same glass walls, same wall clock behind him. I had thought briefly about whether to ask for a different room, something less loaded. I decided against it. There was something appropriate about closing the loop in the same room where it had opened. I sat down. I didn't waste time. I told him I was resigning. I told him my last day, 4 weeks out, in line with the offer I had accepted. I told him I had prepared a complete handover package and would deliver it through the transition. I did not tell him where I was going. He didn't ask, not at first. He sat for a second without saying anything. Then he leaned back in his chair, and his expression did something I hadn't seen on his face in a long time. It became readable. Most of the time in meetings, his face was a careful arrangement, friendly enough, neutral enough, professional enough. In that moment, the arrangement slipped. What was underneath wasn't surprise. It was something closer to recognition, like he had been waiting for this conversation, maybe for longer than he wanted to admit, and was only now realizing it had arrived. "Daniel," he said, "can we talk about this?" I told him we were talking about it. He shook his head slightly. "I mean, is there anything we can do?" I had prepared for that question. I had practiced the answer in my car on the way in. I said calmly that 2 weeks ago I had been told no raise this year, citing budget alignment. That decision had been final enough that it had been communicated to me by HR with an unopened folder. I told him I had taken that decision seriously, the way it had been delivered. I told him I had drawn my own conclusions from it, also seriously. And I told him that the time for the company to do something had been 2 weeks ago, before I had started looking at the market. After that point, anything they offered would only confirm that the original answer had been wrong, and I had no interest in working at a company where the truth about my value only became visible at the moment I tried to leave. He didn't argue with that. He couldn't. He nodded slowly, the same nod from 2 weeks earlier, except now it carried a different weight. I could see him doing the arithmetic in real time. The accounts, the clients, the institutional knowledge that wasn't documented anywhere except in my head. The conversations he was about to have with people 3 levels above him, where the question wouldn't be why I was leaving, but why he hadn't seen it coming. "Where are you going?" he asked. I told him. I owed him that much, and I didn't owe him more than that. I named the competitor. He didn't react visibly, but something in his posture tightened. He knew the company. He knew Ricardo. He knew, without needing it spelled out, exactly what kind of move I was making. HR joined us 15 minutes later. Same HR. Same closed folder, except this one was thicker. The conversation that followed was different from the one 2 weeks earlier in every way that mattered. Now there were questions. Now there was attention. Now there was language about retention. It was, of course, too late. The counteroffer came on Wednesday afternoon, 2 days after my resignation. I had expected it. I had not expected the size of it. My manager called me into his office, which itself was a small signal. He almost never used his office for one-on-ones. He preferred meeting rooms, neutral ground, places where the conversation could be framed as casual. Pulling me into his office meant he wanted walls, a closed door, and the implicit weight of his title behind whatever he was about to say. He had a printed sheet in front of him this time, which was another signal. 2 weeks earlier, HR had carried a closed folder she hadn't bothered to open. Now there were numbers on paper, ready to be shown. He slid the sheet across the desk. I looked at it without picking it up. The base salary had been increased by 47%. There was a retention bonus attached, payable in 2 installments, one immediately and one at the 12-month mark. There was a new title proposed, Director of Strategic Accounts. There was a line about expanded responsibilities for the regional client portfolio, which essentially meant formalizing the role I had already been doing without the title or the pay. I added it up in my head. With the retention bonus included, the first-year total was close to what the competitor had offered. Without it, the ongoing base was still about 15% lower. The math was almost calculated to look competitive without actually being competitive over time. They were betting on the urgency of the moment, on the relief of not having to disrupt my life, on the assumption that a person with a mortgage and a daughter starting college would round up in his head and accept. I sat with the sheet in front of me for a few seconds. My manager waited. To his credit, he didn't push. He had been at the company long enough to know that pushing in that moment would only make the answer come faster. I told him I appreciated the offer. I told him I appreciated the speed with which it had been put together. Then I told him I was declining. He didn't react immediately. When he did, it wasn't defensive. He just asked quietly, "Can you help me understand why?" I told him the truth. I told him that 2 weeks ago the company had answered a question I had been asking implicitly for years. The question was whether my work was valued enough to be paid for accurately. The answer had been no. And the answer had been delivered in a way that wasn't ambiguous. It hadn't been "we wish we could but we can't." It hadn't been "let's revisit in 6 months." It had been "no raise this year," followed by an unopened folder. That was a complete sentence. It didn't leave room for interpretation. I had interpreted it correctly. I had acted on it. And the offer in front of me now didn't change what had been said 2 weeks ago. It only confirmed that the company had always been able to pay more. They simply hadn't chosen to until I was already halfway out the door. He absorbed that. He didn't argue with it. He couldn't, really. There was nothing to argue. The facts were what they were. He asked one more question. Is there any number that would change your mind? I thought about it. I thought about it honestly, not for show, and the honest answer was no. Not because the number didn't exist mathematically, because the trust didn't exist anymore and no number was going to rebuild it in the time available. Once you've seen how a company makes a decision under pressure, you can't unsee it. You can pretend, but you can't unsee. I said no. He nodded. The meeting ended quietly, the way these meetings should end when everyone in the room understands what has actually happened. Word traveled through the office faster than I expected. By Thursday morning, people who hadn't spoken to me in months were stopping by my desk. Some of them were direct. "I heard you're leaving. Is it true?" Others were more careful, drifting over with a coffee in hand, asking how my week was going, waiting for me to bring it up myself. I told everyone the same thing. Yes, I was leaving, 4 weeks, new role at a competitor. I kept the answers short. I didn't editorialize. I didn't tell anyone about the meeting or the unopened folder or the counteroffer. Those were not stories I owed to anyone. The reactions I remember most were the ones I hadn't anticipated. 2 colleagues, both younger than me, both in roles I had quietly mentored them through over the years, came to me separately and said almost the same thing. They told me they had been waiting to see if I would ever leave. They had assumed I never would. Watching me go, they said, made them reconsider their own situations. I didn't know what to do with that exactly. I hadn't left to send a message. I had left because the math finally became impossible to ignore. But messages get sent whether you intend them or not. People watch what others do far more carefully than they listen to what others say. The handover took the full 4 weeks. I spent the first week walking through the client portfolio with the 2 people who would split my accounts after I left. Neither of them had the full picture. Neither of them could have. There were relationships in that portfolio that had been built over a decade with specific people at specific companies, and you can't transfer that in a document. What I could transfer was the structure, the contacts, the history, the recurring issues and the workarounds. The political dynamics inside each client that determined which decisions got made quickly and which ones got stuck. I documented all of it. I sat with both colleagues for hours. I answered every question they asked, and I asked them questions back to make sure they were absorbing the parts that mattered. In the second week, I started introducing them to the clients directly. 1 call at a time. I framed it carefully. I told the clients I was transitioning out of the role and wanted to make sure they had continuity with people who understood their account. I didn't tell them where I was going. Most of them didn't ask in those calls. A few asked privately after the calls ended through personal channels. I told them the truth when they asked directly, and I told them I would not be reaching out about any business relationship until they had completed their next contract cycle with my current employer, which was the right line to hold, and the line I had already committed to internally with Ricardo's team. By the 3rd week, the pace of the handover had stabilized. The new account leads were running the routine calls themselves, with me sitting in as backup. By the 4th week, I was largely answering questions on request rather than driving anything actively. I used the extra time to clean up. I went through my email archives. I deleted personal correspondence. I organized my files. I returned the company laptop bag I had been issued 9 years ago and never used because it was awkward to carry. I left my desk cleaner than I had found it. The last day was quiet. There was a small farewell at the end of the afternoon in the kitchen area near the broken coffee machine. Cake, sparkling juice, a card signed by most of the floor. My manager said a few words. They were generous. They were also carefully phrased in the way that words become when the person speaking knows that the person they're speaking about is going to a competitor. I thanked everyone. I meant it. Whatever had ended, 14 years was still 14 years. I started at the new company on a Monday, 3 weeks after my last day. I had used the gap to take time off, properly off, the kind of break I had not allowed myself in over a decade. Helena and I drove up the coast for a few days. My daughter came with us for the first weekend, then went back to the city for her classes. We didn't talk much about the job change during the trip. We didn't need to. The decision had already been made, the consequences had already played out, and the trip wasn't about processing any of it. It was about resting before the next chapter began. The first day at the new office was disorienting in small ways. Different building, different elevators, different security badge that I kept fumbling at the turnstile. The team had been told I was joining. They were ready. My desk was set up, my laptop was configured, my calendar already had a week's worth of onboarding meetings scheduled. Ricardo walked me through the floor in the morning, introduced me to people whose names I would have to relearn 3 times before they stuck. The managing director who had signed my offer came over personally to welcome me. He shook my hand and said, simply, "We're glad you're here." That was it. No speech. No performance. Just a clear, direct welcome from someone who had clearly thought about my arrival before it happened. The first paycheck landed at the end of the month. I looked at it once and then I closed the screen. I had known what the number would be. I had read it on the offer letter, signed it, talked about it with Helena. But seeing it actually deposited, the full figure sitting in the account, made something quietly settle in me. Not excitement, not pride. Just the small click of a thing falling into the right place after a long time of being slightly off. Almost double what I had been making. For the same work I had been doing. For the same skills I had been developing for 14 years. The number hadn't changed because I had suddenly become more valuable. It had changed because someone had finally been willing to pay accurately for what I had always been. About 2 months in, my old phone rang one evening. I was on the couch. The number was the office line from my previous company. I let it go to voicemail. There was no message. It rang again the next week, same number, different time of day. I let that one go too. A few weeks after that, an email arrived from my old manager, casual, friendly, asking if I would be open to a coffee. He didn't say what it was about. He didn't need to. I never answered it, not out of pettiness, out of clarity. The conversation he wanted to have had a closed window, and the window had closed the moment I signed somewhere else. I have been at the new company for almost a year now. The work is the same kind of work. The clients are different, but the problems are familiar. What is different is the structure around the work. When I raise a concern, it gets taken seriously the first time. When I solve a problem, the solution gets documented and credited correctly. When raises and bonuses are discussed, they are discussed with me, not about me in a room I am not in. I think about that meeting sometimes. 3:47 p.m., the wall clock, the unopened folder, the 5 words. At the time it felt like something had been taken from me. I see it differently now. Nothing was taken. Something was finally shown. And once you see clearly, the only thing left to decide is what you are willing to do about it. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your story matters too.